Kia ora koutou everybody. It's a great initiative for Palmerston North. Thanks to Sue and all the others who have been organising this. It's very timely. What I want to talk about today and follow up to the other speakers are three things. First, the lead up to the recent ministerial meeting in Singapore. Secondly, what happened at that meeting and what some of the implications are of the decisions that we understand were made. And thirdly, what happens next, so far as we know, in this highly secretive process. Before the ministerial meeting in early December in Singapore, there had been a quite intense period of activity. In the middle of this year, the ministers decided that they were going to set a deadline for the end of 2013 to conclude the agreement. Now, everybody was sceptical about that because, firstly, they'd had deadlines before in this now 3-year negotiation and hadn't met them. They were also sceptical because the state of some of the chapters was in considerable disarray. Some of them, such as the intellectual property chapter, was shown by the leak from WikiLeaks last month to have been in August in a state of major disagreement between the US and virtually all of the other countries. And the intellectual property chapter, because it covers both the digital domain, which is a high value area for Hollywood and other content providers, but also is the potential pathway for future services and money and goods delivery globally of crucial importance to the US. The IP chapter, of course, also covers pharmaceuticals alongside the transparency annex, as it's quaintly called, that deals with the processes around entities like Pharmac. So we knew that that was stuck. It was confirmed by that leak. Another area that was stuck was the environment chapter, where there have been strong positions regarding the enforceability or otherwise of whatever the rules are there, and disputes over which of the environmental agreements will be covered. Not simply a dispute between the ASEAN countries on the one hand and the OECD countries on the other, to put it in a sort of richer, poorer West Asian dichotomy, but also because the US has not signed all of these agreements. A third chapter that was really stuck because there isn't any agreed text, because it's actually a quite novel chapter, is the chapter on state-owned enterprises. That's the chapter that I work predominantly around, and there weren't even agreed definitions of what a state enterprise was. And so we were, leading up to the round that they had in Salt Lake City in November, very sceptical about the end-of-year deadline. But it also became very clear in Salt Lake City that the officials were working under very strict riding instructions. They are officials, so they have to work to the mandate that's given to them by their ministers, and that meant that they had to do their utmost to be able to conclude the chapters to the point of political decision making by December. At Salt Lake City, where there was no pretense even of any stakeholder activity, but we were hanging around the fringes anyway, the officials were under much more visibly intense pressure than they had been before. And I put out a press release at the time that was based on discussions with a number of countries' negotiators about bullying taking place by the US within the intellectual property chapter. Our negotiators say that wasn't the case, but a subsequent leak of internal discussions from one country, we don't know which, reinforced the view that there had been inordinate pressure from the US in proposing its text and in not allowing the counter texts from a number of other countries, including New Zealand, to be properly considered in the discussions. And there'd also been a lot of pressure on other areas. In addition, the crunch point probably for the negotiations, which governments are going to use for deciding what trade-offs they'll make, the access to each other's markets for goods and agriculture had not advanced. And this leaked paper that was put up on WikiLeaks in December, the internal paper from one of the countries, also confirmed that the US was playing hardball on access to its markets in refusing to put anything seriously on the table until it had seen what the others were doing on the things of interest to the US. And once, of course, you show your hand, it's very hard to back off, so that worked to the US advantage. So by the end of Salt Lake City, those of us who'd been there came away very clear that there was an intention to wind this up as far as possible by the end of the year, and that this wasn't going to be just another missed deadline. It took a little bit of convincing of people who weren't there that what rationally shouldn't be able to happen, that it was a mess, that there were things that were subject to major disagreement, that there was nothing in this for countries other than the US. Everyone said, well, why would anyone do a deal? We said, well, that's actually the sense of Salt Lake City. In addition, people were saying, why would any government in their right mind make a deal when they can't guarantee that the US will deliver on anything that they promise? And it became clear during the Salt Lake City round in November that the US Congress was not going to grant President Obama what's known as fast-track authority or trade promotion authority. That means the Congress would have to either accept or reject the deal as a whole and not be able to pick it apart. It also meant that there would be a time limitation on the discussion in the Congress, so they couldn't filibuster it so that the debate could go on forever and ever and ever. President Obama does not have fast-track authority at present, and there are sufficiently contentious matters in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement for Congress to want to pick it apart, whether it's on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry or the mining industry or the tobacco industry, or from traditional Democrat supporters in areas such as environment and labour policies, and of course their farmers. So when we were asking people in Salt Lake City, why do you think the ministers will consider this without fast track? They said, well, because we don't think that Congress ultimately will deny him fast track if he signs a deal. The Republicans may have appeared to be strong-arming Obama over the budget issues there a couple of months ago, but they lost political credibility, and if they were seen to block a deal of this sort, then it would not work well for them. So the ministers were prepared to gamble that if they made concessions, then the US would be able to put a deal before the Congress that it could sell. And it could get fast track, or it could get it through the Congress without fast track. So we came away from Salt Lake City quite depressed and sensed the message around that the ministerial meeting in Singapore was going to be deadly serious. The meeting itself was held immediately after the WTO ministerial meeting in Bali, And we know now that there was a lot of preliminary work done in Bali with the ministers and with some of the chief negotiators. I happened to stumble across the New Zealand chief and deputy chief negotiators having lunch with the chief US negotiator, going through a pile of her papers, and it was clear that they were working out the strategy for how they deal with things in Singapore. Once we got to Singapore, where again, of course, there was no stakeholder process, there were media who'd been invited to register, but they weren't told when anything was happening, and in fact, nothing happened for them until the final day. We got a very clear sense that the ministers were serious. And the first indication we had of how they were going to try to railroad this through was that they had split up the ministers into groups of 4. That's the 12 countries had been split into groups of 4, and those 4 could have one official each, and they would sit around the table and try to broker an outcome that would be put to the plenary of the ministers as a compromise deal. The rest of the countries could sit in the background and take notes, but they couldn't speak. Now, in the crucial intellectual property group, the 4 were Canada, the US, and Mexico, plus Vietnam, which meant that New Zealand and Chile, for example, who had been the strongest opponents to the US proposals on intellectual property, weren't at the table. This is a process they use in the WTO called the Green Room process, which is designed basically to marginalise dissident voices and push things through. Now that process trundled along for a couple of days, and we were picking up some pretty disturbing messages about the kind of concessions that were being made. Then there was a bit of a bombshell, which was a leak that came out that was the paper I've referred to earlier, that was an internal document from one of the parties, which was talking about US pressure, US railroading, and a series of issues around the negotiations. So it was clear that there were already some unhappy campers before the ministerial meeting. But at the ministerial meeting, no one was actually prepared to talk about anything to outsiders. There was a second document, which is a chart, and I invite you to go onto WikiLeaks to have a look at this, because it's that country's assessment of where all the other countries are on a whole range of issues. And it showed, again, that the US was being very aggressive or very defensive of its particular interests, without a lot of support from other countries on key issues. So when they come out at the end of a meeting and say that they have made very significant progress, and that progress is such that it has to be able to get through the US Congress, you can make assessments that those concessions are predominantly in the US favour. And that was what we found from a report in the Washington Trade Daily that said on the intellectual property area, there had been a concession by all of the countries except one to work within the US framework. And that effectively meant giving away positions that had been hard held for the last 3 years, including by New Zealand and Chile, because we know that the holdout country was a developing country. Now, whether that is absolutely accurate or not, we don't know, because it's, of course, all secret. But what we did find out as a result of media discussion back here after that was that Tim Grosser conceded 2 things on Farm Act. One was that there would be some changes to Farm Act. He very carefully worded it that New Zealanders would not be required to pay more for their medicines than at present. Now, that sounds really reassuring, but it's not. What it means is that New Zealanders, when they go and buy their meds at the chemists, will not have to pay more. but it, we think, means that the pharmaceutical companies will get a larger share of the Pharmac budget, which means Pharmac will be able to subsidise fewer medicines. That is assuming the government doesn't use taxpayer money, which is patients paying indirectly, to up the budget of Pharmac. So either Pharmac gets more money and more of that goes to the drug companies, or Pharmac pays a larger share to the drug companies and there are fewer subsidised medicines. Grosser has always said the fundamentals of Pharmac will be protected, and I'm sure he would claim that that kind of deal still protects the fundamentals. The second thing that he conceded was that this quaintly called transparency annex on healthcare technologies may require some changes to our processes for Pharmac. Now, he put that in terms of compliance costs. But what that annex actually means is that the pharmaceutical companies would have more influence over Pharmac's decisions and that they would be able to exercise more leverage to be able to get Pharmac to give them the subsidies or the approvals by the agency that does the approvals of drugs. And that's a second way to be able to white ant the effectiveness of Pharmac. There were other areas that we understand were agreed, but we don't know precisely. Now, Tim Grosser again said that no decisions were made in Singapore. It's quite wrong to say any decisions were made. Technically. Now, technically, that's correct, because in these negotiations, they say nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so they have signalled, or they have indicated, and the officials now will be working within those indications, what the landing zones, as they refer to them, will be for various chapters. That means that basically we have given way, and we have given way, we know, without the US putting anything effectively on the table in relation to the holy grail of access to the dairy markets in the US, which is a whole other story, and I suspect Bill Rosenberg may have dealt with that. So they have started to make deals in really crucial areas, without fast-track authority from the US Congress, and without the US making any quid pro quo in relation to its dairy markets, even if that was of significant value to us. So what happens next? Well, they, according to Grosser, the chief negotiators from each of the countries will now be working fast and furious between now and when the ministers meet next, which will be around the fringes of the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos in late January. Now, anyone who knows about the World Economic Forum meeting will know that it's where the major corporate lobbyists do their thing with the political leaders, and it is about as tight an exercise in corporate control as you can get. We think that the meeting, in fact, will be after that in London, and the ministers will be there aiming to pull off more deal-making before they enter into the last phases, which they hope will involve a meeting in April on the side of the APEC trade ministers meeting, and then Obama is going to be doing a tiki tour of the Asia-Pacific region where he can sign a final deal in April. That means the pressure is really intense. Right? Don't believe anyone who says this is just too complicated and it will never happen. There are some important political questions, which is the point I'll finish on. There has now been a lot of polling, and there has been letters demanding the release of the text. There have been public press conferences from the 5 main political parties that have said we require the text to be released. There have been the most recent poll from Avars reinforced some polling that we did back in December, which, excuse me, referring to my notes, said 70% of New Zealanders oppose a deal that would tighten up the use of generic medicines. 56% would oppose the companies, the foreign investors' right to sue, and only 25% support it. 71% oppose the secrecy, and only 10% agree that the agreement should be kept secret until the deal is done. And so we need to put the pressure on to release the text before it's signed, to have a proper analysis that we can do and a proper debate during an election year, and we need to have, in particular, Labour come off the fence and actually take a position that is consistent with the policies it's going to be going to the electorate with, and stand alongside those parties, the Greens, New Zealand First, Mana, and now the Māori Party, in saying this deal is not good for Aotearoa New Zealand. Kia ora koutou.